Hello, and welcome to today's Trainer Education webinar, Leading Across Differences, hosted by HRDQ and presented by Dr. Kelly Hannum. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. Do stay tuned at the conclusion of the broadcast for an exclusive offer. Now, before we begin, note there is a question. It might be called a chat box. It's usually at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You want to use this during the webinar to submit any questions that you have. And then we will either answer your questions as they come in or by email after the session, or even we are doing a live Q&A with Kelly at the end. So you can go ahead and send those in to us all throughout the presentation. You can also join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag HRDQ webinar. My name is Sarah Montgomery, and I will moderate today's webinar. I am in business development for HRDQ, a publisher of research-based training solutions that improve the performance of individuals, teams, and organizations. Dr. Hannum is a senior research faculty member at the Center for Creative Leadership and a visiting faculty member at the IEGSEG School of Management in France. She holds a PhD in Educational Research, Measurement, and the Evaluation from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Kelly is the recipient of multiple awards, including the prestigious Marcia Gutentag Award for the American Evaluation Association. She has published her work extensively and been invited to speak at conferences and events all over the world. She has been on the advisory board of the Leadership Learning Community since 2007 and has worked with a wide variety of clients to help them better lead across differences. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction. I'm thrilled to be able to speak with so many people today about something near and dear, hopefully, to all of us. What I'd like to do before we dig into the content of the webinar is to share a little bit of information about what we're going to talk about, sort of a roadmap for the webinar. By the end of this session, we will have talked about the main concepts related to social identity conflict and specifically conflict within organizations. I plan to share with you a framework for addressing these differences in organizations, as well as the 5 common triggers of conflict that we've seen in our research in terms of how they show up in organizations. We'll also have spent some time talking about who should act in these situations and what actions they should take. And I'll provide a brief overview of 4 different leadership practices that are research-based and focused on preventing or addressing conflict in organizations that are based in different identity group differences. So I probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this slide. It's probably something that's pretty intuitive for most of us, but almost all of us are operating in organizations that are increasingly global, and that means we're increasingly interconnected. And that shows up in our workplaces, and that shows up in our politics, that shows up in all kinds of ways. And this slide is just sort of a graphic to show we're connected economically in ways that we never have been before, culturally, socially, environmentally, and politically. And all this interconnectedness is creating the need for people to lead better across differences that they've never had to lead across before. And as part of our research here at the Center for Creative Leadership, we asked C-level executives how important it was for them to lead across boundaries effectively in their current role. And 86% of them said it was extremely important for them to be able to do so, but only 7% of these executives felt that they were very effective at being able to do so. And that's not terribly surprising, because this is sort of a whole new world that we're leading in, and it's new challenges that we're facing, so it's not surprising that people are having difficulty meeting that challenge. One of the boundaries that we find it's increasingly difficult for people to lead across is something called a social identity boundary. And that may or may not be a term you're familiar with, so I wanted to sort of just give a little bit of background on that, because I'll be referring to it throughout the session. Social identities are the groups that we belong to that are socially constructed. And so what they often look like are someone's gender, or someone's race, or nationality, our age, the generation we belong to. All sorts of things play into our social identity. And we all have multiple identities. So we're not just one thing. It's not just based on our gender or based on our race. It's based on the combination of all those things. And all of us use social identity to help categorize people into groups. It helps us identify with groups ourselves, and then we use those identifications to compare our groups with other groups typically with us preferring our own groups to the groups of others, but not always so. What we wanted to do in the research that led up to the creation of the Leading Across Differences casebook is look at, well, we know these conflicts are playing out in organizations, and we wanted to know more about kind of what surrounds them, how can they be prevented, and what role can leadership play in that. And so you should see on your screen societal landscape picture. And so the picture on the bottom sort of represents what's happening in the world at large, not just in organizations, but in our communities and societies in which the organizations are embedded. And you'll see these sort of squiggly lines off to the left, and those are called fault lines. And what that is indicating is that if there's a friction in society overall, then that friction very often will come into the organizational context, because as we all know, organizations aren't isolated entities separate from society. They're actually very much connected to society. So if there's a conflict at play in society or friction in society, that's more than likely going to come into the organization if those groups are present. So if there's a religious conflict, for instance, in a community in which an organization is present, it would be quite possible and quite likely that there would be a religious conflict within the organization itself if members of both or however many religious parties were present in the organization. So that's what that fault line, so squiggle line, indicates. And just because those sort of tensions might be present, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the surface. They may be sort of under the surface. But what can happen are what we called in our research a triggering event. And so that's something that happens in the organization that creates a spark that makes what was sort of a hidden tension more present and more salient for the people. It starts to exacerbate or create a flame around these identity group differences in organizations. And we'll talk more about what those triggering events look like in organizations. And what then that creates is this opportunity for leadership practices. So that's an opportunity for people in leadership roles, as well as people who are not in a formal leadership role, but are in a position to contribute to helping the situation. It creates an opportunity for them to do something differently or to act. And we'll have, as I mentioned before, we'll have a discussion about 4 different possible leadership practices that could take place there. And it's also quite possible to engage in leadership practices before there's a triggering event. In fact, that would be an ideal time to start thinking about it. And the goal of engaging the different leadership practices is to help move these different groups, these social identity groups in organizations, towards increased direction, alignment, and commitment. And for those of you on the call or on the webinar that are familiar with the Center for Creative Leadership's work, that's sort of our core definition of effective leadership practices. They're things that result in shared direction, increased alignment, and maintaining commitment among a group of people who have shared work. And ultimately, that results in the organization being able to achieve their mission, their outcomes, their revenue targets, all that sort of things that organizations tend to really want to focus on, but obviously they need to have the structures in place for leadership to happen to get there. And you may have noticed off to the left this notion of spillover. Then it's a double-ended line there. And that is just a reference to this idea that tensions within society over large can spill over into organizations, and I talked about that before. But there's also the other direction, in that if people can learn how to get along and lead across differences within an organization, it may make them more likely to be able to do that within their communities as well. So that's sort of a positive opportunity, and that spillover is a reference to that. And obviously there's also the negative opportunity, whereas if there's a tension in the organization, it can also trigger tensions within the communities. And I referenced this idea of fault lines in the previous slide, and I want to go back to that and dig a little bit deeper on that. Fault lines, and this is based on work by 2 researchers named Lau and Murnaghan. I believe their original publication was 1998, if you're interested in looking that up. But their idea was that if there are lots of different kinds of differences in organizations and they're grouped, then the potential for a fault line is greater. So what we mean by that is if people of the same gender and of the same age group and have the same nationality are all sort of grouped together in the same function in an organization, And there's another function that has a different age group, a different group of nationalities, and a different gender, so perhaps one group is all women and one group is all men, there's more differences represented between those two groups. And so there's a higher chance that there'll be tension between the groups simply because there are more differences in perspectives and backgrounds. And so there's more opportunity for disagreement or for lack of understanding a different perspective. And that's something to pay attention to in organizations. To what degree are groups similar to each other, but similar to each other within the group, but different from other groups in the organization? Because in situations where that's the case, there's more likelihood that triggers are going to spark something, some type of conflict within the organization. So one of the main findings of our research was this notion of triggers of social identity conflict. And a trigger is simply an event that sparks or heightens tensions and ignites conflicts between different identity groups. And through our interviews and our surveys, we found 5 categories of triggers, and I'm going to talk about each category on its own. The first trigger is probably one that everyone is somewhat familiar with, and we've called it differential treatment. And it's just situations where one group perceives that another group has an advantage when it comes to allocation of either resources or rewards or opportunities or punishments. We use the word perceive because it may be a factual difference or it may not be, but if the story is out there that there's a differences between groups, then that can ignite heightened tension between the groups. And what that might look like is one group feels another group is paid more, or one group feels like their requests for vacation time are approved where another group doesn't, or one group feels that when they make a mistake or one of the people in their group makes a mistake, they're punished for it, but when somebody in another group makes a mistake, it's sort of overlooked. And so those are all kind of examples of differential treatment. And it doesn't necessarily mean when those things happen then there's a huge conflict. Certainly we can think of examples where these things can be overlooked. But it's just one of the things that did tend to lead up to an increased tension or out-and-out conflict between groups. Another one of the triggers that we saw in our research we called assimilation. And that's when there's a majority group within the organization that expects that other people in the organization will act just like them. It tends to be an expectation that non-dominant groups would blend into the dominant culture. So some examples of this might be following a certain holiday schedule that maybe doesn't take into consideration other groups' religious beliefs or holiday traditions. It could be things around eating practices or dress code. And it showed up in all kinds of ways in our research, but it was just this notion that anyone who is not like and it was often people in the dominant group tended to be in senior leadership positions, people who came into the organization that maybe were from other groups would dress like the more dominant group or would act like and behave like the more dominant group. And in some cases there was some resentment around that and not feeling like they were fully welcomed into the organization and didn't feel like they were able to bring all the talents they could because of this expectation of assimilation. Something we saw less of in our research, but certainly led to heightened tension and conflicts, were insults or humiliating acts. And we can probably all think of examples of these, and hopefully we haven't encountered them ourselves. But this is just exactly what it sounds like. It's when a comment or behavior devalues or offends one group relative to another. And it could be using a derogatory slur about a group. It could look like wearing a T-shirt that has a stereotypical message that's not positive about a group. It can be offhanded remarks. One example might be being in a meeting and someone makes a comment and another person responds by saying, well, of course you would say that. Your people are always saying that. And so that it's something that is a specific behavior or comment or something along those lines that brings group or social identity into the conversation and sort of says that's a reason why you're not as good as or aren't going to get something that maybe you think you should. One of the more difficult triggers that we saw in our research was this notion of different values. And that's when one group has a very different value base or a fundamental belief from another group about what is the right way to do things or what is the wrong way to do things. And this can be a very difficult trigger to navigate because it connects into something people hold dearly, and that's obviously their values. An example of that might be someone being in a role where as part of their job function they need to do something that religiously they don't feel is the right thing to do. A recent example of this in the news that I saw has to do with nurses taking the influenza shot, specifically nurses that were in high-risk situations, ICU type environment, and some nurses saying that they had religious beliefs that were against them taking that shot, but it was a requirement of their job to take that shot. So they were caught in a situation where there were different values at play. The last type of trigger that we came across, and it was not one we saw frequently, was something we called contact. And that only occurred in situations where there was already a lot of friction between the groups. There's already a high amount of anxiety in the broader society, and it was so great that even just bringing two groups together can trigger a fault line. And so the animosity was so high in society that even if you just saw the other person in a meeting, and if they represented the opposing group, it would create a sense of anxiety and conflict and tension within the room. That was a pretty unusual case, and that tended to only occur in the research that we were doing in places like Israel or South Africa, where there were deep-seated tensions between specific groups, and they were long-standing. What we'd like to do now before we move on is do a quick poll and get a sense of what types of triggers are most likely to occur in your organizations. And Sarah, if you could briefly describe how people complete the poll.
Sure. So we're going to go ahead and launch the poll, and I'll go ahead and do that now. You'll have 5 choices here to respond to. And it's just the radio buttons there, so you can choose. You can change your answer if you need to. So if you choose on something and you don't like that answer, you can choose to move it to something else. And we'll give it a few seconds here and wait for everyone to be able to respond. It looks like most people are figuring out how it works.
Yeah, it looks like people are pretty, either fortunately or unfortunately, it seems easy for people to hone in on what types of triggers seem to be most likely to occur in their organizations. And the majority of people have voted at this point, but let's keep it open a little bit longer and just get those last few people. There's people trying to choose between one or the other. Not sure about their vote. And then what we'll do is we'll spend just a little bit of time sort of talking about what's showing up in this call, and then I'll compare that to what we saw in our research. And so far, it's pretty close. There is one notable exception, and we'll wait for those last few votes to come in before I mention it, because I don't want to skew what people are doing. All right. Looks like we have almost everyone here, so I'm going to go ahead and close that off, and then everyone should now be able to see what the results are that have come in. Right, and so I'm not terribly surprised that differential values or different values is pretty highly rated. That is one we saw a lot, and that's a difficult one for people to navigate. We'll talk about some strategies for doing that later on in the webinar. The differential treatment is actually a bit higher than we saw in our research, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure what might be leading up to that, and perhaps that's something we can come back to during the question and answer session at the end of the call. It's not surprising to me that the contact is such a low percentage of people. It's pretty rare that the tensions are so high that even just putting people in the same room is enough to get things sort of sparked and flying. And then assimilation was one of the triggers that we saw a fair amount in our research as well. And it can be a pretty, well, as they all can, but it can be sort of one of the more hidden sort of triggers for people, and it can be harder one to discuss, because often for people in the dominant group, the assimilation is just sort of an assumed thing on their part, and it's not something that is easily it's easy to point to, so it can be one of the more challenging triggers to sort of work through. So thanks for sharing those insights. It gives us a nice sort of snapshot of what's going on, at least in terms of the organizations represented in this call. One of the other things we looked at in our research that we're going to do a poll on here in a minute is, let's assume that something does happen in the organization and there is a trigger that sparks some conflict. Who should take action? And this is one of our survey questions. And so what we'd like to do is go ahead and post this poll as well and give people a few moments to select when triggers occur, who do you think should take action? And responses are starting to roll in. And so the choices are the immediate supervisor or supervisors if there's more than one involved. If there's multiple groups, there may be multiple supervisors. The individuals that were directly involved in the situation, human resources or talent management, whatever that function is called, and in organizations, or our senior executives. And in our survey, and you can look at the results, it's a rather long document, but we did publish the research results on the Center or CCL's website, and you can go dig into those data much deeper. On the survey, we asked about lots of different types of potential actors, but for the purposes of this poll, we tried to limit it to just 4. It's a little overwhelming to have a list of 15 on there. And it looks like the voting is starting to level off, so maybe we can go ahead and publish that. And what you should be seeing on your screen now in terms of who should take action, it very closely reflects what we saw in our survey data. Typically, it was a combination of both the individuals that were involved in the situation as well as their direct supervisors or their direct supervisor, depending on the nature of the conflict. Often people felt that was the best place to start, at least in terms of what they shared with us on the survey, and then it would escalate up to perhaps human resources or senior executives, depending on A, whether or not the issue could be resolved, and then also B, how serious the situation was. Some of the other potential actors that we asked about in the research, but we didn't have on the poll, are people like union representatives, as well as, depending on the nature of the conflict, religious leaders or community leaders or government folks, as well as legal, if it was a serious situation. But most often, people felt the best place to start, or the most obvious place to start, was the people directly most involved in the situations, including the individuals as well as their supervisors. One of the more interesting findings we thought, and maybe we shouldn't have been so surprised by this, but one of the interesting things to come out of the research was this notion of doing nothing and just how often that would occur in organizations where there was a conflict. Is a manager or someone in a formal leadership role would know about a situation but not do anything about it. And there seemed to be quite a few reasons for this, but the main ones were that the person didn't feel like it was necessarily his or her role to take action because it was a conflict about social identity, and therefore it was something that seemed private or personal. So for instance, it could be around a religious value, or it could be around a perception of differential treatment, and the manager or person in the leadership function just didn't feel like that was part of his or her role within the organization, that should be handled somewhere else. And then another sort of thing we saw show up in the research was that the person didn't know how to handle the situation. It wasn't clear what action to take, which sort of leads up to our next piece of the webinar. And that is the 4 leadership practices. And so we really wanted to dig into this from a research perspective, because we were seeing through our interviews and our surveys in organizations that indeed these social identity conflicts were happening and that leaders were feeling ill-prepared to address them when they did. And so we wanted to not necessarily come up with a cookbook strategy for what to do, because every situation is somewhat unique, but at least some ideas about what are the possibilities, what are things to consider when this happens in an organization. And so the 4 practices, or 4 categories of practices we came up with are, and we'll talk about these in more detail in a moment, decategorization. And what that basically means is creating a third space. And what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and bump to that slide. you'll sort of see a diagram there at the bottom to give you a sort of visual representation. But basically what decategorization, or creating a third space, means is that you start to place emphasis on the people rather than the groups, and you create spaces for people to get together and to get to know each other. And what this is primarily based on is something that was called, or is called, the contact hypothesis. And that's the notion that if there are strong differences between groups, and often strong stereotypes about groups that may be accurate or often maybe not, giving people the opportunity to get to know people from another group just as a person and not as a representative of a group can help sort of break down those barriers, because as they interact with one another, they start to see that maybe there are a lot more similarities than they would have initially thought. So they maybe start talking, if they both have children, maybe they start talking about their children or what they hope for their children or what they want to get out of their career, and they start to realize, maybe this person's a little bit more like me than I realized, and maybe they're not so bad after all. And so decategorization is the practice of creating the space for those interactions to happen. And some ways to do that, some basic ways to do it, just to encourage people to get to know one another as individuals. Sometimes that's just a matter of making the space available, and that could look like social activities or volunteer type activities that the organization may do that sort of create the space for people to get outside of the groups they're in and get to know one another. Sometimes there can be actual training involved. So we say here, encouraging active listening, being candor, and having a learning orientation. And it may be possible and appropriate in some cases to actually provide some courses around that. How do you do that? What is active listening, and how do you do it? In some cases, people might benefit from a little support there. And as I mentioned before, just giving people some time and some space, and trying to make those interactions as frequent and as routine as it makes sense to do so. And there at the end is just a sort of a note of caution about not requiring people. If there's a great deal of tension, and you may see this especially in the situations where the trigger might be contact, there's so much tension at play anyway that just getting people together creates some anxiety. You want to pay attention to, because you certainly don't want to push people into situations where they feel threatened or they feel very, very anxious. You want to help them work through that. So just paying attention to the dynamic of creating the space for interaction, but also recognizing that interaction needs to be functional. And so if it's creating more harm than good, then pulling back and trying another tactic. One of the other leadership practices is this notion of recategorization, or activating a shared identity. And most of you are probably familiar, maybe even participate in something like this. It's just simply trying to find something that the group has in common and emphasizing that. And so it's something that everybody can get on board with. And so in our interviews and our research, one example of that was the mission of the organization. So they may have other types of group differences, but perhaps everyone in the organization is compelled by and committed to the mission of the organization. The extent to which that can be emphasized, it'll help people work through some of the other differences that they have. So some specific ideas around that are helping people make connections between their groups and the larger shared goals. And that can be helpful both at the individual group level, but also across groups, so people understand the value that different groups contribute to those larger goals. And also help prioritize goals or identities that are motivated and inclusive of all the groups represented in the organization. So there's not one group getting more excuse me, there's not one group that has more association with the goal and therefore seems more important. And the other sort of recommendation around recategorization is revisiting and reiterating the group goals often. And that's particularly important in organizations where they see the demographics of the organization shifting. I think probably a lot of us on the call see that in our organization, see that in our communities. The people that we're working with, the people that we're in community with are different. It's shifting. We've got shifting ages, shifting races, and all sorts of shifts are taking place. And so having the space to reiterate and talk about group goals on a somewhat regular basis can be pretty helpful. And one thing to pay attention to when embarking on sort of a recategorization strategy is not to ask groups to give up any core values or core beliefs to the extent that that's possible. And that can, admittedly be tricky in certain situations, but really trying to work with what's the most inclusive language, what's the most inclusive framing we can use. And lastly, not cloaking conflict within a larger goal. Some level of conflict is probably to be expected, but at the same time, being overly accepting of it, it probably isn't the best way to go. And so just paying attention to, is this a constructive conflict, or is this something that's actually going to be detrimental to the group, and taking action in the latter case. Excuse me. The third leadership practice that we wanted to highlight is something called subcategorization, and that's basically embedding groups within the larger whole. And that's sort of a both-and strategy. What it basically is saying is provide the space where people can talk to other people that are in the same group as them. And by group, I mean social identity groups. So that may be a functional group, so that may be all the marketing people, but that may be a different kind of group. That may be a women's mentoring group, or that may be a young professionals group. But basically providing a space within the organizational structure that people can talk about their shared challenges, their shared perspective in a non-threatening way, but also emphasizing that collectively across groups there is a larger subordinate goal that people are connected to. So it's sort of a both-and strategy where you're reinforcing that superordinate goal, but also maintaining the space for people to talk about various identity groups within that. So in terms of some tactics around this, giving voice to all groups, working with groups that they have the space that they would like to have. And again, this notion of emphasizing that groups create and contribute unique value towards the higher purpose, and they may do that in different ways, and the extent to which that's clear and articulated can be helpful. And then providing the space, and there may be other forms of support that organizations can provide financially or structurally to help groups create within group cohesion. And so that may be a women's mentoring program, or that may be a young professional group that does community service, or something like that. There's all kinds of examples, and those are just a few. One of the cautions around subcategorization is not creating situations where group identities or tasks are not linked back to some sort of larger organizational identity goal. And that's basically just reinforcing this notion that you don't want a group that's seen as a strong, well-represented group, but that is not connected somehow to the larger organizational goals. So the value that groups bring is pretty important to be clear about and articulate. And then lastly, the last leadership practices we called cross-cutting, and that's just mixing up roles and groups. And that could be through job levels or function or occupation. And the aim there is sort of similar to the first one, but it's basically to allow people to get to know one another, but also to spread out the representation of groups throughout the organization. And we use the word disadvantage on this slide, but it's really about all different kinds of groups being represented in different ways. So you get the opportunity that comes from having diversity present in the workforce. And so some specific ideas around cross-cutting include considering identity group representation when planning initiatives and planning teams. And that's certainly not the only thing you want to consider, which is the connection to the next point, and that's you want to make sure people are qualified for the task, the assignment, or the role. But beyond that, there may be opportunities to say, well, these people are equally qualified. Perhaps we would get more out of including this person on this team because they may bring a slightly different perspective to the team. And the third sort of recommendation or bullet point around this is really trying to focus on and unlock the creative potential of cross-boundary teams. So often differences can be seen as sort of a burden or a challenge, and that's certainly an accurate perspective. But equally accurate is this notion that when you bring different perspectives together, if they can communicate and work well together, there's a lot of creative and innovative potential there. And if that can be unleashed, it's pretty powerful. So focusing on trying to unleash that can be helpful in the positive aspects of bringing together different identity groups. Which brings a different kind of tenure to the groups. And then the caution here on the cross-cutting side is don't try to force fit contract. Don't try to force fit the contact where it's not appropriate. And then a very specific and obvious example of that is if people don't meet the qualifications or it's not a good fit for them to be on that role or have that assignment for another reason, then it may not be wise to put them in that situation yet. There may be some additional development needed, or there may be someone else that's a better fit. So just to take that in consideration when considering using cross-cutting as a strategy can be helpful. And we just got a few more slides before we get into the question and answer session. And what I wanted to do is give you just a few specific actions that individuals can take, and then in the next slide I'll talk about some specific action organizations can take. And the one is probably not rocket science necessarily, and it's treat everyone with respect. That was one of the things we looked at in our research, and that seems pretty obvious and a commonsensical thing to do. But what's interesting is how differently people look at what's respectful. And so really paying attention to what does it mean to be respectful for different people and then acting accordingly. But that was one of the critical things that people across identity groups really wanted from their leaders and from others in their organization, was to feel like they were respected. Even if people didn't agree with them, they wanted to feel like their perspective was heard and respected. Another thing that people can do, and this is true for someone in any level of the organization, whatever role they play, but particularly true for people in leadership roles, is trying to pay attention to whether or not there may be potential triggers in the organization, and sort of keeping an eye out for those 5 triggers that I talked about earlier in the webinar. And then in addition to that, knowing if there are systems and policies in place within the organization for averting or dealing with the triggers. And that's just a way to make sure the individual is aware of what are the expectations in terms of what the organization has of how I'll handle it, and what are the options available to me if I'm ever in a situation where I need to address this. The 4th bullet around investigating issues from multiple perspectives is actually kind of connected to the second around whether or not there are potential triggers in the organization. So for people in different identity groups, we will bring different perspectives to the workplace, and we may miss some triggers if they're being seen from another perspective. So the extent to which you can check out and be connected to different types of people in the organization, the more likely you're going to be able to see potential triggers, and also the more likely you'll be into addressing them appropriately. So if something happens, that's another time in which you might want to draw on talking to different kinds of people and drawing on that larger network to get a better sense of what's actually happening here and what are the different perspectives around it, which is connected obviously to this last point in terms of trying to form a diverse network and ask for feedback and advice around what are the most appropriate and effective responses to situations, because what may come to mind initially may not be the best responses, especially in situations where it's an extreme or a pretty serious trigger. So spending some time to get different options from different perspectives and really understanding what's the consequence of handling it this way versus that way can be helpful and well worth the time. And then finally, organizational actions, and they're just 4 here. One is just encouraging and providing those opportunities for groups to get to know each other, and that's engaging in one of the 4 leadership practices. That can really do a lot to creating the trust and the social cohesion that can help people overlook when there's a trigger if it's something that wasn't intentional, or help them know how to address it more effectively if something does happen and needs attention. And making sure that policies and procedures are aligned with the mission and values of the organization and with the overall business strategy. And that sort of articulated alignment can be very helpful to people where for those who are in leadership, functional leadership roles, who do perhaps have a group or are members of their group that are connected to a trigger that's happened, that'll help him or her understand why it's important they do take action. And then the 3rd point around the systems and policies, that would help that person in that situation understand what their options were. So being clear both about why the policies and procedures are in place and how they actually do contribute to the business strategy, and then also what to do when something happens that maybe isn't ideal within the organization. What are the expectations of the organization, and what support is there for the people in the situation directly, as well as the people who are supervising those in those situations. And often, particularly in larger organizations, multinational organizations that are spread across geography, if it's appropriate, trying to allow for decision making at the lower levels of the organizations and communicating what is and isn't negotiable at those different levels. And what that does is help people make contextually relevant, it creates the opportunity for them to act in ways that are contextually relevant and contextually appropriate. Because one of the things we noted in our research is there are very different ways for handling trigger situations. Even if the categories sort of look similar, the actual behaviors involved and what actually who talks to who may vary. And so allowing for people at lower levels in the organization to take action can actually help it be more effective. And that's obviously something to pay attention to, because it's not always the right way to go, but very often it can be. And that's the conclusion of the scripted part, and now we can move into the question and answer. And Sarah, I don't know if you wanted to go ahead and do the thank you here, or we wanted to do that after the Q&A.
Yeah. We'll go ahead just to give some more people time to send in some questions. So go ahead and, it's usually up in the right-hand corner, but go ahead and type in your questions. We'll give you a couple minutes to do that. And while we collect those questions and kind of sort through some of those, I do want to thank you for joining us today. The Leading Across Differences, which is the foundation of what Kelly has been presenting today, is a flexible course. It's good for a 1-hour session or even a fuller, longer extended course, half day, a couple days. You can really work with the material. The package consists of a comprehensive casebook and then also the facilitator guide. And the casebook includes the Leading Across Differences framework. It gives you 13 research-based cases, 11 chapters written by leadership experts, 9 individual exercises, and then it also gives you references and resources. So if you want your group to extend the learning, that's also provided for you as well. The information in the facilitator's guide then will help you craft a session or a series of sessions organized around your specific learning outcomes. And so for joining us today, you do get the facilitator guide. It's at an exclusive low price, 40% off, $47.40. The offer is open on all quantities. You can share this with your coworkers and your organization. You can get it at HRDQstore.com. You do want to use the coupon code WebinarLAD, and that offer is good until the end of the month. Now, it does look like we have a bunch of questions coming through here, so if we run out of time and we can't answer everyone's questions, what will happen is Kelly will get those and she'll respond specifically to those through writing, and then actually we email those to everyone sometime next week. You'll get an email so that you can see all the questions that have come in and then Kelly's responses to all of those. But I do have some that I can go ahead and get started with. Feel free to keep sending those in there. So Kelly, let's start with Amin's question here. He asks, what should managers do once the conflict, has happened and the damage is pretty much done at that point?
Right, and that's a difficult situation to be in, but certainly one that's not uncommon. So often, the best course of action is doing one of the things I mentioned in the slide, and that's really finding out from the different perspectives involved what happened, what's going on with them, how do they feel about it, what would they like to see happen next, and sort of just doing some broad information gathering, really paying attention to talking to the different perspectives that may be present in the situation to get a full understanding. And there may be different levels of trust, and so obviously someone in the management or leadership role needs to kind of understand that they may not be getting the full story because people may not be fully comfortable sharing it with them, but at least make the ask the questions and give people the opportunity to share the perspective. And then another thing that showed up in our research is really simple but really powerful was apologizing, and how very often people just really wanted to have what had happened acknowledged as something that should not have happened to them, assuming that was the case. In many cases it was. And they just wanted to feel like their group had been heard, or that they had been heard, that somebody understood that this was not ideal, that this had a negative impact on them. that alone maybe isn't enough to turn things around, but very often that was helpful. More may be expected, especially in cases where there's, systemic differential treatment or things like that, where there is additional action that could be taken to sort of alleviate the situation. But at a bare minimum, often just getting the full story, allowing people to share their perspective, and then offering up an apology, even if it isn't something that the manager was directly involved in, just acknowledging that person is sorry for what happened and is, assuming it's true, willing and committed to doing something to help it be better in the future. Now, what can be really damaging is just saying you're sorry and not meaning it. So you don't want to just say, oh, well, that happened, I'm sorry, but we're not going to change anything, and I'm not going to do anything about it. And that can be damaging because that can further sort of demean people's experience. So just taking into account apologies, but only if you really mean it and plan to do something.
Yeah, opening up that dialogue and communication as well. Great. Our next question was back actually from around our polling time around assimilation and hiring. So TM talks a little bit here about the ability to fit into a culture is probably part of that hiring process, both for the person being interviewed and then also for the person doing the hiring. And we were wondering if you could speak a little bit around sort of how does hiring then play a part, and should assimilation be considered? How much should that be emphasized? Is there anything in your research that sort of addressed that?
That's a fantastic question, because it is one of the trickier things. So there's clearly, people take in hiring and selection decisions take into consideration, is this person going to be a good fit with the culture of the organization? Are they going to be able to be happy and flourish within this organization? And that's an important thing to pay attention to. But what can be challenging is if there's a really strong organizational culture that maybe isn't inclusive, and it's preventing the organization from accepting differences of perspective or differences of experience that actually would be really helpful to the organization if they were able to shift and allow for that difference to be present in a way that was respected. And so it's a pretty idiosyncratic. I don't know how helpful my response is, because it is a pretty complex situation to be in. But really looking at and continuing to pay attention to, are we ruling out or not selecting people based on fit in a way that's actually going to harm the organization over time? And obviously there can be legal issues. I know there are callers from all over the world, and so those legal issues are going to vary by country, by state, wherever their location is, and whatever their industry is. But paying attention to that as well. If you're consistently selecting out a specific identity group, and I'll just use women as an example because it's an easy one. Paying attention to what else might be going on. Is that a legitimate exclusion, or is there something larger at play, which could be called discrimination?
And I could even see, from an age perspective, as organizations get older, potentially if they haven't done a lot of hiring or haven't had a lot of turnover, and they start, adding a new employee that might be, fresh out of college, you would see a difference there between those. So I could even see over time, certain of that, depending on how much turnover you have in your organization.
Absolutely, yeah. And then the shifting, especially in organizations where it's been around for a long time and there's been a lot of stability, then there may be a really strong culture that's reinforcing a similarity among people. It's really kind of cliquey at that point, and it's hard to bring somebody in and accept that they're different and let them be different versus saying you just need to kind of get on board and be like us because we're all happy here and so forth. So they're tricky waters to navigate for sure, but paying attention to the metrics. And then also if you bring someone in, this is another place where things go or can go awry. If you bring someone in who doesn't necessarily fit the mold, supporting them and helping them fit in ways that aren't damaging to the person, that are supportive, and that's going to vary by organization in terms of how to do that and what's the most important. But bringing somebody in that's a little bit different and not supporting them can sometimes lead to that person either not meeting expectations and being terminated or being constricted in their role, or that person sort of feeling like they've made a mistake and moving on, and that's obviously going to have some cost associated with it in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm. Great. Our next question here comes in from Joyce, and she's specifically speaking around the 5 triggers, and asks, are the 5 triggers equally provocative?
That's an interesting question. I think the triggers tend to take place in different ways. So the contact trigger, for instance, usually only occurs when there's already a lot of animosity at play. And so the trigger itself may not be that provocative, but the situation is already so, for lack of a better word, it's already so kind of heated that when that occurs, it's pretty provocative, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then certain triggers may, depending on the situation, may cut to the core more than others. So, for example, the differences in values playing out, since values are something that typically people hold pretty core to who they are as a person and as a group. When there's a clash around that, it can be pretty emotional for people, which is not to say the other triggers are not emotional, but that tends to be a pretty core difference for people. And then obviously, differential treatment is speaks to people's access to resources, and there can be pretty heated arguments around that as well. So there's not necessarily one that's more or less provocative. I think they're provocative in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Great. And we have several people asking for examples. And they're asking about, some of the different leadership practices. So just to kind of sort of summarize all of those questions, could you give some specific examples on those different leadership practices?
Sure. So and let me see if I can flip back on the slides a little bit so it's a little clearer what I'm talking about. Give me a second. So this notion, for example, of recategorization or activating a shared identity, some of the ways organizations do this can be in really small symbolic ways, and it might be, for instance, having a company T-shirt day or something like that, where everyone sort of wears the same T-shirt, or small things like that. And that's not going to shift a culture overnight, but looking for ways to reinforce the inclusion. Having big company parties that invite, of course, there's not a lot of budget for that these days in many organizations, but doing social events, things that connect everybody to the organization at large, meetings, and not necessarily face-to-face meetings, maybe just virtual meetings of people in the organization where they can celebrate as an organization what they've accomplished together across the different groups. Those can be examples of ways that organizations might want to activate or could activate a shared identity. And I shared some of the examples around subcategorization in terms of that notion of reinforcing the both-and dynamic at play in organizations, where there's a celebration of what the group is together and what everyone has in common, but also a recognition that there are different identity groups, and they may have some unique conversations that would be helpful, and they could maybe use the space to have those private dialogues with one another. And in some ways, those are some examples of what that might look like are, like I mentioned before, perhaps women's mentoring groups, or groups that focus on professional development of a certain function. It may be a celebrations group, or groups that focus on honoring the celebrations of a certain culture, maybe even in some cases sharing aspects of that culture with the larger organization in a way that celebrates the subgroup, but also acknowledges the commitment to the larger group as well. And I'm going to do slide one more. And the cross-cutting are just, specific, anytime there's a specific task force or a specific cross-functional work group opportunity, or advisory board, things like that, looking for opportunities where it makes sense to mix up different identity groups, so people have more opportunity to work with people who are different, to do real meaningful work with people who maybe have different perspectives, so they can get that exposure to different perspectives, and there's less of an entrenched us-them dynamic. I didn't use that language earlier, but that's language that you'll commonly hear in the social identity world, because what it does, social identity groups sort of trigger this us-them. This person's is one of my group, and that person's one of their group, and it creates this real strong us-them divide lines that become entrenched and difficult to work across. And to the extent that people can sort of travel across that and create relationships across those dividing sort of us-them lines, then the more permeable those boundaries become, and the easier it is for those groups to sort of begin to see perhaps a different perspective and to work across those differences.
Great. We have time here for one more question. You can continue to send in your questions, and Kelly will answer those after our session, and you'll get the answers to those by email. Actually, everyone on the line today will get the questions and answers from Kelly today for everything that was sent in. But our last question here is from Kiri, and they're asking around triggers that are happening potentially at the senior management level. So say, two senior managers are really not getting along, and how does that, is there, obviously there is a trickle-down effect, on the staff in terms of impacting the culture in a negative way. But can you give, some sort of ideas around maybe how either the staff responds and deals with this, or maybe the management team can deal with that when it's at, really that high senior management level?
And that is one of the trickier situations, because depending on the situation, it can be pretty difficult to give someone higher up in the organization feedback on something that's challenging. So again, what one does is going to need to be in reference to what's going to be appropriate in that specific situation. But some ideas for how to address that might be people letting the obviously people in senior management roles or senior leadership roles are role models, for better or for worse, for others in the organization. And so maybe if others on the management team at that same level or above can sort of help them see that how they're behaving isn't in the best interest of the organization, maybe validate how they feel in the situation, but say, we really need to think about the larger perspective here and what's in the best interest of the organization overall, and try to work towards a resolution that's going to move both groups in the right direction. If it's possible for people who maybe even are lower at a lower rank than that person, if they have a good relationship, sort of to share with that manager or that supervisor the impact that his or her behavior is having on others in the organization, because they may not be fully aware of or fully connected to the trickle-down. All of us sort of intuitively know there would be trickle-down from that, but those specific managers or those specific leaders in that specific situation may not actually be fully aware of how his or her behavior is playing out more broadly. Mm-hmm. And so if someone is in a trusting relationship with that person, just letting them know, and not necessarily in a value judgment way, but sort of letting him or her know, I just thought it would be helpful if you would know we're kind of noticing that this is going on, and this is sort of some of what people are saying, or this is how it's impacting people. And leaving it at that, and maybe not even offering advice to the person, just sort of giving them information about what the situation is from different perspectives.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly, for your time today and sharing all of your expertise. And so that is all the time that we have for today. If we did not get to answer your question, you will receive an email response that'll come out early next week, and that'll give all of the questions and then Kelly's responses to each of those. We do hope you had a great webinar today, and we certainly appreciate your time, and hope you found today's webinar informative.